All right, this is Jeff Christensen, and I'm the president of EntryPoint Networks. And I've asked Bruce Patterson to sit down and spend 30 minutes. EntryPoint provides the software for the open access network that runs in Ammon, Idaho. And Bruce is the technology director in Ammon. And for many of us, Bruce is the face of the Ammon network. I think he's probably also the soul of the Ammon network. And part of the hypothesis for EntryPoint, a question in our minds is, can we replicate what's happened in Ammon without a Bruce Patterson? So is the model repeatable, and is it scalable? And Bruce is an important part of that hypothesis because he's done so much to drive the success in Ammon. So we're gonna talk about the time that's lapsed since 2016 when the network was launched, and our view of the world. Really, I'm mainly interested in Bruce's view of the world since the launch of the network. There's a lot of things we didn't know then that we know a lot more about now. And so we've just got a series of questions just to sort of explore what's happened over the last 5 years and where we are today. So first off, let's start with the problem. When you started this project, I think the problem was just framed as a problem of getting fiber optics into Ammon. A neighboring city had some fiber, and it was posed to you that that's the problem to solve. We probably think about the problem a little, we've expanded on the problem a little bit since then. So how would you describe the problem as it exists in the United States today, and how does Ammon solve that?
Sure. And I think you touched on the core of it, Jeff, with kind of how you phrased the question, because I think the problem for a lot of people is really easy to identify. Okay. So, they're frustrated with available bandwidth, or they're frustrated with reliability. They're frustrated with the choices they have, or they feel like they're paying too much. So they can identify those problems. They understand those problems. And frankly, when we first started, those were really the problems that we identified. Why could we not attract businesses? What would help our residents? And we felt like it was those issues. It really came down to choice, more bandwidth. How do we influence the price to make us competitive with our neighbor, Idaho Falls, who, as you mentioned, had their own fiber optic? So that was really the problem. And the challenge is when you look at the problem that way, there are a lot of voices. Okay. There's a tremendous amount of voices out there. Some of them are saying that, hey, we're on the right track. Bandwidth is going up, price is going down for what you pay for that same bandwidth as compared to what you paid a few years ago. So we're taking care of the problem. Some will point to emerging technologies like 5G, and they'll say, hey, this is going to solve the problem. So you have all of these voices telling you, the problems you've identified in access and affordability are going to be taken care of by technology. But the truth is, if you dig into this, it's not a technology problem. We have lots of technologies that will give us the bandwidth, that are reliable. And frankly, they cost less to install today than they did a number of years ago. So it's not a technology problem. What you said is correct. It's a model problem. It's a framework problem of how we economically build these things, how we pay for them, and how those that use those systems pay back to use them. So as we dug into it, the problem turned into, how do we do this in a way that gets us ubiquity? In other words, how does everybody in the community connect at a price they can afford, get the bandwidth they need with the reliability they need? And that was the problem we started to get to. It took us from 2008 to 2016 to actually arrive at what we arrived at, which was the utility model. I mean, we came to the conclusion that, trying to fund a private investor, trying to help them drop the price wasn't going to do it. Trying to figure out how to fix the regulated system we had with the phone company wasn't going to do it. So the only way really to do it was to create our own infrastructure. And the only way to do that was to make it a public infrastructure treat it as a utility. And lo and behold, that started to address a lot of the problems we could see. We could achieve ubiquity over time. We could manage the price. We could build it to meet our bandwidth requirements instead of letting somebody else dictate what it was we needed and tell us that we had more than enough, which is pretty common with the incumbents. They'll say, hey, you have more than you need. You don't want to pay for anymore. So we felt like that was really the solution. So I would say the problem that Ammon is addressing today is we're a true public infrastructure. That infrastructure is treated as a utility. We use utility financing and utility frameworks to operate and own it. And we allow competition across that really helps to achieve prices that are not seen in other places. So that's the problem I feel like we're addressing and how we're addressing it.
Yeah, that's terrific. Yeah. And you don't hear that framing very often. And, I think part of the Ammon message is reframing the problem. And
yeah, I think that's a mistake to think that so often we hear it, we're on the right track, which I don't disagree with. We've made improvements. Bandwidth has dropped in price. But here's the problem. People are still dissatisfied. So it's almost like we use the road system a lot, right, Jeff? You and I, we've had these conversations, and it's almost like you have a road and you're unhappy with it. It's too narrow.
Yeah.
It's got too many potholes. So your solution is, let's go find somebody to build us another road. So you get another road built, but now you've divided the people that use those roads and you're paying to support two roads, especially when you don't want to give up this one because it kills any opportunity for choice. So the point I would make is that as a country, we have to get to a strategy where we recognize that we're going to have one public infrastructure for the vast majority of what we're going to do, just like our road system.
Yep.
Yeah, there's a place for private roads, but those are probably pretty limited, and they're limited and specific in the needs that they meet. And I think that's the transition that we're going to see. I think it's going to happen. The question is, how do we manage that transition?
Yeah, really good. So given all that, if you were giving advice to the governor of Idaho or the FCC chairman or a Senate committee, what would you tell them? What advice would you give them in terms of getting to a solution that achieves at a much broader scale, at a state level or a national level, what you've been able to achieve for the people in Ammon?
I think one of the big mistakes that we absolutely have to get past, and I think there's an enormous amount of public opinion that supports this right now, is we've got to quit trying to define what broadband is for each individual by saying 25 megabits down and 3 megabits up is sufficient and that's all anybody needs. Because that's driven at a national level, meaning that the FCC comes in and says, hey, if you have that, you've got everything you need. And what happens is all these frameworks and policies drop into place that just make it incredibly difficult to do anything different. And we're not good at that. That shouldn't come from the top down. That should come from the bottom up. Each community should be able to say, this is our situation. This is our educational system. This is what it needs. These are our businesses. This is what they need. And they should have a way to fund that. And the problem is we have regulation and policies in place that prevent that from happening. So one of the first things we need to do is we need to let go of this idea that on a national level, we can just create this policy that says, once you have this, this is enough. And then all of these barriers drop into place to prevent you from being able to do anything or to access any funding that would be helpful to you to do anything. Instead, what we should do is put things out there for these communities to be able to access, tools for them to use if they want to do something. We should create pathways that allow negotiations between public and private partners. We should put financing out there that allows a community to access public funding to create public infrastructure for broadband.
Yeah.
So that's the advice I would give. We shouldn't be dictating from the top down what people want, what they need. We need to set the table, set out a set of tools that communities can make their own decisions. And then I think we're going to see that dynamic really change dramatically. And we are going to see a lot of public infrastructure and a growth, a huge growth in private services across that public infrastructure.
Yeah. Good. There have been other successful municipal networks. Chattanooga's, by all means successful. Longmont, Colorado, Sandy, Oregon. So there's a good list of successful municipal projects, which have really brought new value to those communities. What distinctions would you draw between what you've done, and not to denigrate at all what they've achieved, but going back to the idea of the model and the importance of a model, what distinctions would you make between the Ammon model and successes in other places?
Sure. And I appreciate the way you phrase that, because, those are all great examples. They really are. We leveraged their experience and they shared openly with us. And we might not be exactly the same, but Ammon couldn't be where it is without some of those cities that you mentioned. Chattanooga, we had conversations with, and they were very open and shared. Sandy, Oregon was very helpful to us. Utopia, some of the cities in Utah that you haven't mentioned, they were very helpful to us too. And even Idaho Falls, our sister city that had the fiber previous, they were helpful to us.
Yeah.
And I think the answer to a lot of what you're asking me is each and every one of us had a specific set of tools based on what we had. As an example, Idaho Falls had an electric utility. Chattanooga had an electric utility. A lot of what they did leveraged that. So a lot of their success was based on that electric utility. Others did not have that, like Sandy, Oregon. And in fact, I think Sandy, Oregon and Ammon have something in common. We really had to start from scratch. It required a tremendous amount of community buy-in because we did not have funding to build a fiber optic system. We're not permitted to take tax dollars and just go build this. We're not permitted to take utility fees and wastewater fees and build this. We had to go to the community and say, this is what we can do, but you've got to fund it. And it took us a while to figure out what mechanisms, what tools were in the toolbox that we could do it with, and we arrived at the LID. So in answer to your question, I think that part of what the Ammon model can demonstrate is that you don't need an electric utility to do this. That any community can do it. And in fact, it doesn't necessarily even need to be a municipality.
Yeah. That
a community out in the county could do it. And they should be able to leverage traditional utility models like co-ops and mutuals to do that. So my hope is that's part of why I would encourage other cities to look at what Ammon's done, is to get you to think about how can you meet the needs of your community? And one of the biggest challenges, how are we going to fund it? How are we going to pay that back? And how are we going to operate it? And I think, we have some things that we could share with other communities to help them to see how to do that.
Yeah, good, really good. So a lot's been written about Ammon. There's been, I think Robert Peterson did a search, and I think he came up with over 75 articles that have been written. You've had an FCC chairman come visit you. You've had another FCC chairman, Chairman Wheeler, participate in the Ammon launch and really praised this model. Chris Mitchell did a mini documentary in 2019. Fast Company magazine said Ammon is the best fiber optic network in America. And now in 2020, you've had the cost of connectivity report say that Ammon has the lowest cost fiber network in the world. So all of this, attention to your project and what you've done. Now there are 4 projects under construction explicitly saying they're replicating what Ammon's done. We are replicating the Ammon model. There's a dozen others that are in a planning process. What advice would you have to those that are going down the road you've gone down, knowing what you know now after these years, and them being at the more of the start of their journey? What advice would you give to them?
I'd probably start with know the problem you're trying to solve. I think that there's an enormous amount of distraction anytime you start to talk about broadband or the internet. I mean, there's just this rapid pace of innovation, and it leads to a lot of fear and uncertainty, especially for a community or a municipality as they look at it, because they're interested in long-term, sustainable, stable solutions. That doesn't sound like what we've seen out of the internet over the last few years. You see a lot of turmoil. Look at what COVID has done to internet services, how it's just really thrust some clear to the top and others have been pushed down. So, it's a very tumultuous environment. And I think it's very, very easy to get distracted. So my advice would be know the problem you're trying to solve. And I'm going to make the point that the problem you're trying to solve is the infrastructure and the economics. And if you stay focused on those two things and you look towards proven, reliable technologies, which you're going to find is fiber, it can do it, and virtualization is becoming, it already is in the technology world. That's the solution we apply to so many things to make it scalable, resilient. So why not apply it to networking? So I think that's key. Number one, know the problem you're trying to solve. Don't get distracted. Stay focused on that problem. Remember that as you implement things, it needs to address those problems. Don't let something else take over. Second piece of advice, and I think this is really critical, is to involve your community from the start. And that's really hard, is really difficult. People will think, well, the technology challenge is the hard part. That's for us here, that's EntryPoint's problem, the technology part. The hard part for us is the community thing. I like a quote that Yoko Ono and John Lennon, they're credited with this, but this is a quote you'll hear attributed to them. They said, "A dream you dream alone is only a dream. A dream you dream together is a reality, or is reality." So yeah, that's the point I'd make. Too often, I think you have leaders, they dream a dream, but they don't take the time to get the community to share the dream. If you can get the community to share the dream, no problem, it's going to be reality. But if you cannot get them to do that, you're going to be very, very challenged to be successful. And that's one of the things we found in Ammon. So if you can go to your community, show them that you can bring the cost of their connectivity down, that you can give them reliability, they can do these things, then I think that they should come on board. If they communicate back, sometimes it's frustrating because they don't understand. You've got to be patient. You've got to explain things thoroughly. And when you make commitments and promises, you have to deliver on those. And if you can do those things, things will start to come together. And I promise you, you can do it and you can be successful if you involve your community.
Yeah, even without Bruce Patterson.
Absolutely.
Okay, good. So you've demonstrated the ability to drive costs down. You've demonstrated the ability to implement a new model, something that hadn't been done before. What do you hope to demonstrate going forward that you have not demonstrated yet?
Well, I have to tell you, we're blessed, as it were, with providers that were innovative, not afraid to come in on a shared common infrastructure and compete. I have to give huge credit to FiberCom, QuickNet, Sumo Fiber. There are providers. They came in and they weren't afraid to offer a service across the infrastructure that wasn't theirs. And they weren't afraid to slash their prices and trust that we would maintain the service level they needed on the infrastructure. So I'm very grateful for that. I'm grateful that they were willing to compete and come in. So I think that's a key part of it. What I really would like to demonstrate that this will work in other places, just like EntryPoint would like to, that this will work other places than Ammon. That this isn't just some unique lab experiment, but this is a true utility. You can replicate it. It doesn't take specific pieces that only exist in Ammon. You can do this in any city or any community across the country. And I'm very interested in seeing that happen. I don't believe that our future when it comes to connectivity is based on one specific economic model or one solution. I think it's really a patchwork of networks and systems and operational models. And I think that public infrastructure will play a key part in it. I think automation and virtualization is really key to stitching all of those different models, different infrastructures together. And I think that's the role that automation and virtualization will play in helping us to realize that goal. Excuse me. So I think that's what we'd like to demonstrate. But let me talk about where I'd really like to go here locally with Ammon. because that happens all outside of me. As much as I want to help these other communities and I'll share, I can't get them there. They're going to have to do that on their own. But here in Ammon, what I'd like to demonstrate is that we can actually take this fiber, this infrastructure, we can open it up to everyone. Your regular homeowner could be his own service provider. And that's a little bit of an odd statement. It'll take people a while to think about this. But here's the thing. If you're paying for that fiber and it goes to your home, shouldn't you be able to see how it's performing? Shouldn't be able to see what it's doing? Shouldn't you be able to put your own service out to the rest of the world? And shouldn't you be able to choose what service is going to come back to you? And even researchers agree, we're going to enter into a world where the distinction between what's the public internet and what's a private network, that line's going to get very, very blurry. And the average user isn't going to be able to tell. So what I'd like to demonstrate is that what we've built in Ammon will support that without any kind of a forklift upgrade. We're prepared with the infrastructure, EntryPoint's prepared with the software. And so as we move into this future, hopefully we're skating to where the puck is going to be, not where it is today. So I think we've got a lot to prove yet, but I feel very good about the path that I see networking on and the path that I see Ammon and EntryPoint on.
Yeah, good. So in terms of that, in terms of virtualization, even in terms of automation, because automation in a way is a service, meaning it has the potential to deliver new value for subscribers. So is there one or two solutions or services that you're particularly interested in over the next year or two as these technologies really are available to you?
Yeah. You know, Jeff, that's a tough question, because if you'd have asked me that question even 5 years ago, I probably would have given you a different answer than I give you today. And what that proves to me is that this is a constantly moving target. I mean, who thought we'd see the value of what Zoom is doing for us or some of these other providers? You know, that what happens is the world changes and the services and how we use our connectivity changes. So you're asking me for my best guess. One thing that I feel fairly confident about is public safety. So public safety predominantly is a local service. And, you know, we've seen how that's a little bit challenging in our day and age as people move away from landlines, we move to cellular or location services. We always tied the ability to call 911 and they knew your address.
Yeah.
We're working around those things with mobility and we're trying to figure that out. Reverse 911 is another instance where, you know, how do we know that we're calling the right people that are in the right geographic space? And again, from a mobility standpoint with cell phones, we're working on that. We have solutions we're doing. But what about that connection to the home as we all move to the internet? How do we know? How do we contact people? How would we do that reverse 911 when there isn't a cell phone in the home and maybe it's just the kids or whatever it might be? I think that's interesting. And I think when you talk about public infrastructure, we're in a perfect place to start to address that. And you've seen Ammon engage in that public safety space because we believe that adds value, particularly for those local people. But as you look at public safety, it's not just them. I believe that it's very interesting to think about the local school district having their own virtual network across that infrastructure. So we're not talking about VPNs across the internet, which we can do today. We're talking about adding value to just the local loop and not having to send traffic into another state and back just to connect students to a school that's down the street.
Yeah.
So I think if we can start to do some of these things, we can inject more value back into our local community. We've seen the value leave our local community because of the scale that the more metropolitan areas offer for businesses, for education, for things like that. It just becomes easier. Their connectivity is better. I think virtualization and some of the things EntryPoint is doing has the ability to bring the value back into the local community to allow us to live wherever we want and still work as we need to, get education as we need to, and get public safety as we need to.
Yeah. Good. That's excellent. Really good. So what would you do differently? Knowing what you know now, you're not just 4 or 5 years down the road, you've really been working on this for more than 10 years now. What would you do differently if you were just starting today, knowing what you know?
That is such an incredibly tough question. And I know this is no surprise to you. You know this isn't the first time I've been asked that.
Yeah.
And the reason it's so tough is it's like asking you, what would you change in your life? Because yeah, we all have regrets, we all have failures, but you know, they make us who we are just as much as the failure, or just as much as the successes, right? So
Yeah.
if you pull those out, I don't know what all the life lessons you've got are.
Yeah.
And I don't know what you actually are when you pull those out. So when you ask me, what would I change? I think the way I would say that is that if I knew then what I knew now, yeah, there's some things I would change. I think we could be more efficient. I think we would have landed on the utility solution a lot sooner. I think we would have separated service from infrastructure a lot faster than we did. And I think we would understand what the implications of that are and how to do it. And I think we're actually still learning a little bit of that. So we're still learning what it means to separate those things, but we've come a long ways. But I think that it was really important. I feel good that the truth be told, Jeff, for Ammon, this isn't just for Bruce Patterson, but for Ammon and Mayor Kirkham, Mayor Coletti, Councilmember Powell, all the people that were so important to the development of what we have today. I think all of us, our conscience is clear because our motivations were pure at every step. It was never about us. Mm-hmm. And I think we always just looked at what we had and we said, how do we use what we have to try and move it to the next step? And we always trusted that once we made that step, the step after would become clear, because there were times we did things and we weren't sure if we could take the next one. And I think EntryPoint's had that experience too, right?
Yeah. Yep.
But I think there's a level of trust when you feel like we're doing the right thing. And this will happen with or without us. And we want to be part of this change because we think it's a positive one. So I realize I didn't really answer your question, but I think what in effect I'm telling you is I think everything we went through contributed to our success and what we are. Yes, some of them were problems, challenges we had to overcome. And there are things that we know now that we wished we hadn't done. The problem is back in the day when we made that decision, it was the only decision to make.
Yeah. Yep.
So my hope is, rather than worrying about the past, can we take those experiences and change policy for the people that are going to follow us? That's a lot more important than me spending a bunch of time thinking about what I would change for me. I'm a lot more focused on what I want to change for the people that are going to come behind me.
Yeah. No, that's excellent. I love that answer. You know, the question we get asked a lot, and I think you do too, is why has Ammon gone so slow? You've been very deliberate, year by year by year. And I think it's hard for people. So EntryPoint and Ammon have kind of done this dance together. And EntryPoint, the answer I give them is A, Ammon built it themselves, and B, they've been dependent on EntryPoint providing this software, which in reality we were building as we went. And we have been a limiting factor in terms of how fast they could go. I mean, scale has always been a concern. And so it's been a limiting factor in what you could do. And the softwares had to get to the point where scalability was supportable. So that's the answer I give. But unless you've kind of lived it, it's hard to know, it's not just putting fiber in the ground. So Sandy, Oregon proved that you can put fiber in the ground in 1 year and do the city. So that wasn't the problem. It was everything else that we've been trying to develop, which is the first time that a city has done it in this way. So, we've lived it, and so we understand it, but it is confusing to people looking in on why hasn't it happened faster?
Yeah, and I think, you mentioned Sandy, Oregon, and again, I mean, I just marvel at those guys. They've incredible determination, great, fantastic, solid plan, good community support, but you have to remember they started with wireless.
Yeah.
And they created, a need, a demand, and they had a bucket of money from what they started with the wireless to fund that fiber optic. And they came up with a plan and pitched it to the community and said, these will be your rates and we can transition to fiber, and they got it built out. Again, I applaud that, but Ammon didn't have that bucket of money. We didn't start with wireless. We're starting with fiber. So this is our first foray in it. And so just like Sandy had to do, we don't force anybody to do it. Sandy couldn't go to people and say, you're going to pay for this wireless and you're going to take it. They had to prove that it was value. And in Sandy, Oregon at that point in time. Everybody wanted it because there really wasn't a good solution except for what the city offered them.
Sure.
In Ammon, that's not necessarily true.
Yeah.
We've got an incumbent phone company, we've got an incumbent cable operator, but clearly when you look at the demand that the city has, people still aren't getting what they need. I mean, there's no reason that somebody will participate in an improvement district and agree to pay over $3,000, even if it's a lien against their home and they pay it over time, or whether they pay it right out of their pocket. That should tell us right there, people are not satisfied with the status quo. Something has to change. They wouldn't pony up $3,000 to do it unless they trusted what the city's doing and they were very unhappy with the options they have otherwise.
Right.
And so I think that's a message that not just applies in Ammon. I think you'd find the same thing true in other cities throughout the country, that if people were told, hey, you're already spending this money, okay? This $3,000 you're going to spend in the next 5 years or less.
Yep.
So once you can kind of make it clear that this is about creating a public infrastructure that encourages competition, that's going to drive the price down and adds value to your home instead of adding value to the operator's asset.
Yep.
Those are different things. But to really get the community to understand that takes a period of time. And then what you're going to find is there are still those that don't believe the city should do that. They don't want the city to install a fiber through their yard. They don't feel like they want it at their home. And sometimes they're valid reasons. Maybe they really are satisfied with what they have.
Yeah.
I don't know. The fact of the matter is, we cannot treat this like we do our water system. So in the city of Ammon, if you build a home, you pay a connect fee. You're not given the option to drill a well. And frankly, you wouldn't do it anyway because it's going to cost you more money to drill that well than it is to simply pay the connect fee.
Yeah.
So I answer this question about why it's taking so long to the fact that policy, the law, does not allow us to treat this fiber optic system as a utility like our water and sewer. That does not mean that the city itself, as we operate it, that we are not treating it as a utility. We are. We are treating it as a utility. However, it is an optional utility. And unlike water or wastewater or electricity, where you're told this is your provider, you have no choice, we're not permitted to do that. I believe that over time, it will become clear that that's necessary for us to be competitive globally. That we will reach a point in time where there will be one public infrastructure that everybody pays into on a regular basis. We're not there yet.
Yeah.
I think we have to prove it to ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really an interesting link between policy and the constraints you've lived under. It's good. We don't have a lot of time. Two more topics I want to cover. One is digital divide. Your view, I mean, you're dealing with it on the ground. What do you think we need to do in Ammon and then also nationally to connect everybody?
Well, this is really where it gets contentious, Jeff. Just to be frank with you, this is a very contentious subject because we all agree that we need to solve the digital divide. There's no question. We agree on that. Where we can't agree is on how to do it. And my viewpoint's probably pretty simplistic, and it won't be popular with some. But how did we get power to every household? What household doesn't have water? What household, when you flush the toilet, has a problem getting that to go away?
Yeah.
I mean, basically, we set an expectation where that's an essential service. We require people to have it, and we require everybody to pay into it in some fashion that's fair.
Yeah.
That's a utility infrastructure. So, frankly, City of Ammon can't solve that digital divide without the right public policy in place. And the truth is, we don't have the public policy to solve it.
Yeah.
It's going to take the courage on the part of leadership to implement this. And the challenge is that everybody can see somebody's bull gets gored. Not everybody walks away from that a winner.
Yeah.
I believe that with the right leadership and the right plan, we can create a framework that allows those that are for-profit private companies to migrate to being that ubiquitous public utility that serves every address within a certain footprint. And they should be given that choice. There are privately owned for-profit companies that own infrastructure that if we simply set the table and said, we're going to require that everybody gets this connection, they would move that direction because they recognize if they don't, we're going to build public infrastructure over the top of them.
Yeah.
It won't be popular, but it's a move that gets us to solving the digital divide. And frankly, from my experience, that's the most logical way to move it, is just simply to create an environment where we have a strategy, and over a set period of time, we're going to solve this problem, make that openly known, and allow people that have infrastructure to move into that arrangement or remain the private road if that's what they want to do.
Yeah. Good. All right. Last question. This may really be a restatement of things you've already said, but what about Ammon will have the biggest impact over time? What about there's an obvious local impact in your city. What do you think about the model has the potential to have the biggest impact?
If we can open up the potential for communities, municipalities, communities within the county to leverage utility models to build broadband infrastructure, that's the biggest impact. If they're put into a position where the same low interest, long-term monies are made available to build public broadband infrastructures as we use to build wastewater systems or water systems, then that's the biggest impact. That's really the discussion that's happening right now. We just don't always phrase it that way, but that's really a lot of what you see going on, is the conversation between the existing incumbents and them feeling that these are unfair advantages that would be given to communities or municipalities, that they're not going to compete with them because they have longer term financing, they have lower interest financing. And is that appropriate? And the answer is, if this is an essential infrastructure, we believe it is true. And that's, again, where I would say that we need to, at the same time we enable those things, allow a private company that's been operated for profit up to that point in time to access those same mechanisms and to move over if they choose to do so. So as we open this up for a municipality, for a community, what we need to do is open up that same potential for an existing business to transform their operation, to take that same role on and be able to tap those same advantages so that we can push the price down and get this to everybody at an affordable price. If that's really our goal, that to me seems like the right way to do it. And I think that's the greatest potential impact that Ammon can have, is getting policymakers to understand the difference between the incumbents and what's going on, and how we open this up to get connectivity everywhere, ubiquitous and affordable and reliable, so that everybody has the same advantages, can work from anywhere and get education from anywhere, and telehealth, all the things we talked about. Yeah. So I think that's our biggest potential impact. Jeff, I'll make one other comment. I don't know that I'll feel we're successful until the word or the term, the Ammon model, leaves our vocabulary. As long as that's there, I don't know that I'm going to feel that we're successful. It needs to just be, we've got a fiber optic utility,
Yeah. And do you see open access as core to that definition, or do you see open access as an optional component of it?
I think it's core. I think it has to be available. I think there might be situations where, even though it's available, you still end up with one primary service provider, at least for the immediate future, and that's okay.
Yeah.
but the economics and the framework needs to be set up so that when that second one comes along, there isn't some barrier.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I do believe the openness of the infrastructure is absolutely core, because if you don't do that, you end up turning the service into the public utility, not the infrastructure.
Yeah.
The key to making the infrastructure the public utility is the openness. And that's really what EntryPoint has solved for us.
Yeah. Great. Well, I've been talking to you for 10 years, Bruce, and you're always fresh. You've always got new things to say, and it's always cogent. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. So.
Well, I appreciate EntryPoint's role and the relationship that we have as well. And I hope that this is helpful to you, and I hope it's helpful to others.
Yeah, great. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Yep. Thanks, Jeff.